Okay, hi. So I know this isn't the most ideal format to record this, but we did just screen record the whole thing and then twice and just found out that it didn't have audio. So this is the only other option we think that we can figure out how to work. So our apologies if it is not the easiest viewing experience.
Okay, so this is Heated Rivalry, Queer Representation, Gender Expectations, and LGBTQ plus mainstream television by Liv McCaffrey, Piper Otis, and Nikki Turkula. So within our presentation, obviously Heated Rivalry is a TV show that just came out this year, and it's one of the first queer television shows or media that's come out that's like really taken over mainstream media as opposed to just like niche groups, which queer media is typically found in. Everyone's been talking about it. It's been a really big buzzword and lots of stuff on social media. So we just wanted to dig into why that is and its cultural impacts. So the show was created by Jacob Tierney, if I'm saying that right, and it follows two professional rival hockey stars who unexpectedly fall in love. The story explores how they navigate the relationship while dealing with the pressures of professional sports culture, which, as we know and we'll talk about more, is a very weird culture, especially how we view it with men in America. And this narrative challenges traditional ideas of masculinity, gender roles, and sexuality within the sports. And as mentioned, its very big popularity reflects a broader cultural shift towards the normalization and mainstream acceptance of LGBTQ plus media and identities. So its relevance to this class, obviously, as we've talked about, the media that we consume strongly influences public attitudes towards certain topics, and especially with things like gender, sexuality, and identity, which are very big things that have been explored recently. This definitely does shift focus and shows a new perspective on these sort of things, especially since historically queer representation in television has often been very heavily stereotyped, hidden, or completely underrepresented or represented very inaccurately. And professional sports culture, especially hockey, is frequently associated with very rigid masculinity, heteronormative expectations. And so this has become very significant because this story places a queer love story within a traditionally hyper-masculine environment, which again is not commonly seen in mainstream media. It expands on LGBTQ plus visibility, and it challenges assumptions that people have about athletes, masculinity, and emotional vulnerability, especially emotional vulnerability within these spaces. And the themes explored that we will look at in this presentation are masculinity and emotional vulnerability, LGBTQ plus representation in mainstream media, changing audience expectations for inclusive storytelling, and the growing influence of streaming platforms and fandom culture.
Alrighty, so Heated Rivalry and its cultural impact. Just to start off, to give a little bit more of a background, Heated Rivalry follows two rival NHL players, Shane Hollander and Ilya Rozanov, who fall in love while dealing with the pressures of professional hockey culture. What makes the series stand out is that it places a queer relationship within a hypermasculine sports environment where LGBTQ plus representation has traditionally been limited. The story first gained popularity through its original novel, which later reached a wider audience through the TV adaptation. Social media platforms like TikTok and online fan communities helped the show grow quickly and become part of a larger conversation surrounding queer representation in mainstream media. The series also reflected a large shift in contemporary queer romance. Instead of focusing on only a tragedy or rejection, Heated Rivalry centers an emotionally complex, intimate, vulnerable, and realistic relationship development. The show challenges traditional ideas of masculinity by portraying two professional athletes who are emotionally open and vulnerable with each other. This has had a real cultural impact, especially after NHL player Jesse Cordum publicly came out as gay after being inspired by the positive response to the series. Overall, Heated Rivalry demonstrates how media can shift conversations on LGBTQ plus topics, as well as the visibility, acceptance, and representation within sports, which we'll get into more after. Here is a video talking about just another conversation on heated rivalry. And one of the most important things is oftentimes having conversations about media, whether positive or negative, to increase its visibility.
Okay, wait, I'm gonna try to play the video one more time.
Okay.
Okay.
People are heated about it. So let's start with the heat.
It's a phenomenon that it unwrapped before our very eyes.
There was Beatlemania, Trekkies, Potterheads. What would be your catchphrase for the impact of Heated Rivalry, the TV series?
Like, you can be a hater or a heater, but you gotta pick a side. Hey, what got me into it is the conversation about it. I feel like the conversations we're having around the show are very interesting because, like, it bridges things that you wouldn't expect to be together, like homoeroticism and hockey do go very well together, but it's a taboo. So, like, if you like bring it in the light, it makes it interesting. It makes like queer men and women like feel like they belong in hockey for some reason, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Most people didn't know how hot gay sex was.
Gotcha.
And it brought that.
Yeah.
Now everyone is thirsting on it. Everyone is like, this show is so hot. It breeds us to like say that gay sex is actually hot, which like it's been the nerve of the war for gay men being like, gay sex is something that boggles people because like it's in the butt and stuff like that. That is just like, okay, but now with imagery that yes, it's in the fantasy, but also straight sex on TV is fake and like fantasized and like it's TV. That's what it's for. So I find that this part of the conversation like does legitimate gay sex in a way that hasn't been done before. And also a lot of people like the happy narratives. For me, they're a little too soft. They never show you the homophobia, which I'm like, I don't need to have it up from a sociological standpoint or very realistic. It could be one character that is like in total bad faith or like saying things in the locker rooms or something. But then the whole thing is something that is named, but it's never something that is shown to me.
This is not a show for men. This is a show for straight women. Let's remember fantasy. This is a fantasy romance. I don't think it ever wanted to be anything but that. So no, there is no reality. There's no politics. There's no homophobia because for once, this is what a Harlequin romance is for straight women. You get to step into a whole other world where there's no danger. Everybody's safe. Everything is okay. It's just called stepping away and living something else for a minute. Queer characters, queer stories are more part of the landscape. I like it when there's no over explanation and when it's just the norm, if you like. Don't like that word, but like it's part of the scenery.
It's happening.
To me, it's happening. This is also an odd, let's remember quickly that this is an odd example because it is, I agree, it is a fantasy tale. It was not meant to be a social critique.
The importance of this video is that it really highlights why heated rivalry resonates so strongly with audiences, especially younger viewers. One of the biggest things discussed is how the show's queerness is not treated as shocking or overly political. Instead, it is presented as normal and a part of a larger story about love, fear, identity, and emotional connection that reflects, honestly, how a lot of Gen Z audiences engage with LGBTQ plus media today. I would say another major takeaway from the video we just watched is that audiences connected with the show. Some agreed, some disagreed, but truly this constant conversation was because this show portrayed a queer relationship with humanity and emotional depth rather than relying only on tragedy or stereotypes.
Moving on to challenging masculinity and gender expectations in sports culture. Specifically, toxic masculinity in elite level sports mostly idealizes aggression at its core, and just the normalization of locker room talk. It's talked about so just like in passing and like it's so normalized, but it's really just really vulgar things being said about women and sex and just not and in a really aggressive manner. In elite sports, there's a lot of pressure for men to be hyper-masculine in order to be accepted by their peers and their teammates. There's a huge correlation between being masculine and being good at your sport and you have to be more masculine and stronger in order to be perceived as talented or like you're good in your field. Because of this, many queer athletes have been driven to suicide, and one of them is Justin Fashanu. He committed suicide in the 90s because of the pressure he faced as a closeted gay man who was also a professional soccer player. Young male hockey players are actually statistically, they have lower emotional empathy, they view danger as more exciting, and they have more callous attitudes towards sex and see violence as a manly behavior. So just shows the correlation between specifically how it starts young, toxic masculinity in sports and how normalized it is. The concept, real men play through the pain, is also incredibly harmful and detrimental to young men's mental health. It invalidates their emotions from an early age and makes it hard for them to develop strong emotional development. Heated rivalry specifically challenges societal expectations. It highlights not only just athletes, but elite level athletes at the top of their field who challenge these norms from the top down. The two protagonists are Shane and Ilya. Shane struggles with disordered eating habits, anxiety, pressure to conform, and issues accepting his identity as queer. And Ilya, who is perceived more outwardly as a masculine man, struggles to accept his emotional depth is valid and doesn't make him any less of a man. Overall, the show emphasizes that their emotions are positive attributes and not weaknesses, further contributing to their challenging societal expectations against men in sports and how they should behave.
One of the biggest reasons Heated Rivalry stands out is because of Shane and Ilya's relationship. It feels emotionally realistic rather than performative or stereotypical when it comes to media. The relationship is not written just to make a statement about being queer, but it's written like a real relationship with emotional complexity, conflict, vulnerability, intimacy, and growth. It makes the characters feel more human and relatable to audiences, regardless of sexuality. This series avoids a lot of the classic tropes that older LGBTQ plus media often rely on. Historically, queer stories in television and film were frequently centered around tragedy, rejection, secrecy without resolution, or characters whose identities only existed to create conflict. Heated Rivalry, however, does include struggles with secrecy and public pressure, but it's the relationship itself. It's not treated as something shameful or doomed. It's the focus of itself is beyond just the queer relationship. Instead, the show allows the characters to experience love, emotional intimacy, and personal growth in a way that feels more hopeful and authentic to its viewers. Another important aspect of the series is how it portrays intimacy. The emotional connection between Shane and Ilya is just as important as the romantic relationship itself. Their vulnerability within each other challenge traditional ideas of masculinity, especially within professional sports culture, where emotional openness is often discouraged or made fun of and kind of outcasted. The show presents the vulnerability as a strength rather than a weakness. Secrecy also plays a major role throughout the series because they are professional hockey players. They feel pressure to hide their relationship due to judgment and fear of media attention, which reflects a larger societal issue surrounding LGBTQ plus visibility within sports culture and highlights how difficult it can be for athletes to openly express their identities. I would say that queer relationships presented through Heated Rivalry is presented in a way that feels emotionally grounded and authentic versus reducing the queer characters to stereotypes or tragedy. It's portraying them with emotional depth, humanity, as a mainstream romance story.
Okay, so with all that being said, the rise of queer media in mainstream entertainment, I would say that in the 90s, there was a bit of a shift with how queer characters were portrayed in a lot of shows. This obviously has a lot to do with societal norms at the times and people's general acceptance with same-sex marriages or relationships in general. And that shift started around the 90s. So before that, LGBTQ plus characters were often just hidden through coded subtext, only portrayed as stereotypes and used as comic relief or tragedy. And they were never really centered in mainstream entertainment. You see the example of like the gay best friend or just the comedic relief, the side character that just kind of follows them around and doesn't really have a lot of depth to them. And it was, if their sexuality was brought up, not only was that their only character trait, but it was a source of like negativity or surrounding the character or always a problem. This started to shift around the 90s when there was a lot more increased visibility like we see today. We started to see shows like Will and Grace, Queer as Folk, and Brokeback Mountain. And I think I read somewhere it was like The Nanny in the 90s was one of the first sitcoms to acknowledge someone's queerness and not have it be a central part of the storyline in a negative way. It kind of changed that focus of having that be like the sole identity of the character and tried to transition it more into that is a trait this character possesses, but they also have more depth to them. This is allowed to have a lot more contemporary queer media that portrays characters as emotionally complex, multifaceted individuals, central protagonists as opposed to those side characters, and characters whose identities extend beyond their sexuality alone. And not only is this important, obviously, because as someone who is queer, watching yourself portrayed on television in such a boxed in, inaccurate way, and maybe thinking, especially queer youth, that is all that they can amount to, and that's their only source of identity, is just clinging on to a representation of them that isn't accurate. But you also have people who may never have been exposed to a queer person or queer communities in their life, and that inaccurate representation that is always generally made by people who aren't a part of that community is their source of reference, which, as we've talked about in this class and we've brought up before, what you're seeing in media obviously influences your biases and how you navigate life. So having these inaccurate stereotypes represent such marginalized communities like queer communities really does impact them in a very negative way. So Heated Rivalry obviously challenges that, and they, as we mentioned, they avoid reducing their characters to just these stereotypes that we typically see. These two characters are very emotional, complex, vulnerable, which I think is a very key aspect considering that they're vulnerable men in sports. And it's more realistic to what a queer relationship really entails as opposed to this fantasy that we see through stereotypes in these side characters that we've seen for so many years. The series challenges assumptions that professional athletes must conform to rigid masculinity. Queer men cannot exist comfortably within sports culture, and LGBTQ plus stories are separate from mainstream entertainment. Like we've seen for so many years, they're challenging that, and it is beginning to change.
Moving on to the complexities of mainstream queer media from more of a critical lens, a big question that comes up in critical conversation about Heated Rivalry is it popular because of hypersexualization or because of true societal acceptance? A lot of the discourse surrounding the show is about two of the main actors, Hudson and Connor's appearances, the way they look, their bodies. They're two conventionally attractive, lean, muscular men, whereas in the movie Pillion, which is a similar queer love story, came out around the same time as Heated Rivalry, didn't receive the same treatment, and even in some of the social media marketing for the movie, they tried to capitalize on Heated Rivalry's success, but all of the comments were insulting the main actors' appearances and their looks and saying, we don't want this isn't the same thing, all because they weren't conventionally attractive the way that the Heated Rivalry actors were. Which also comes to the question, what kind of queer media is profitable? In general, male queer relationships are more accepted and do better profit-wise and bring in more revenue than media about female queer relationships. And even if you just, what comes to your mind when you think of like a queer movie, it's most likely going to be Brokeback Mountain, Call Me By Your Name, Moonlight, probably not Imagine Me and You, or another movie about female queer relationships. And then these I pulled from the Heated Rivalry press tour. It's from an interview. One of them's with Teen Vogue, and then another one's with a different news source. And they looked at tweets and the actors reacted to them, and it was a whole thing where they tried not to laugh. But in other interviews, they've talked about how they wish that more of the discourse was surrounding their approach to the characters and the emotional depth that they brought them, rather than just how they looked or their physical attributes while playing the roles. And these are all pretty vulgar sexual physical comments about the actors.
Okay, so in conclusion, this begs the question of how does heated rivalry affect the future of queer relationships in mainstream media? As queer television becomes more mainstream, especially with the help of social media and the millions of streaming services we see today, representation is no longer just about visibility like we've seen before, just having some token characters, but it's also about portraying these stories in an authentic and diverse way. Modern audiences increasingly expect LGBTQ plus characters to be portrayed as nuanced, realistic individuals rather than these stereotypes that we've seen for decades and decades and decades. Media has the power to shape cultural attitudes, as we've discussed, and this is really important when we're talking about gender, sexuality, masculinity, and identity, considering we have such strong preconceived notions and traditional elements that have held us to these standards for so long. We need to start breaking them. So, final takeaways: heated rivalry demonstrates how contemporary entertainment can challenge traditional gender expectations while expanding LGBTQ plus representation within spaces that have historically excluded queer identities. By placing a queer love story within the world of professional hockey, the series reflects broader cultural changes towards acceptance, inclusion, and more emotional complexity storytelling in mainstream media. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.